When someone in the audience started crying, Steve Harvey stopped the joke mid-sentence. What happened next wasn't in anyone's script. The studio lights were blazing as they always did on a Tuesday afternoon taping of Family Feud. Two families stood at the podiums, the scoreboard glowed with anticipation, and Steve Harvey was doing what he does best, delivering that perfect mix of comedy and charm that had made him America's favorite game show host. The audience was laughing, the families were competing, and everything was going exactly according to plan. Until it wasn't. Steve was mid-joke, his signature smile lighting up the stage, when something made him stop. Not a technical issue. Not a producer's cue. Something else entirely. A sound from the audience, so raw and so real that it cut through everything, the laughter, the music, the carefully orchestrated energy of live television. Someone was crying. But this wasn't the polite, camera-ready emotion you sometimes see on game shows. This was something deeper. Something that would change everything about the next 15 minutes of television. Steve's smile faded. His hand, which had been gesturing mid-punchline, slowly lowered. The microphone dropped to his side as his eyes scanned the audience, searching for the source of that sound. The studio, which seconds ago had been filled with laughter and energy, fell into an eerie, complete silence. The cameras kept rolling, but nobody knew what to film. The producers in the control room leaned forward in their chairs. The families at the podiums exchanged confused glances. And Steve Harvey, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes and handled every possible situation on stage, stood completely still. Because what he was witnessing wasn't part of the show. It was part of something much bigger. In the third row of the audience, partially hidden behind other guests, sat a woman who looked to be in her early 60s. Her name was Margaret, though Steve didn't know that yet. She wore a simple floral blouse and held a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. Next to her sat her daughter, Sarah, who had one arm wrapped around her mother's shaking shoulders. Margaret wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because, for the first time in 18 months, she had laughed. Really laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep inside, the kind she thought she'd never experience again after losing her husband to cancer just over a year ago. Steve had made a joke. Just a regular Steve Harvey joke, the kind he'd told 1,000 times. But for Margaret, in that moment, it had broken through the wall of grief she'd been living behind. And the release was so powerful, so overwhelming, that the laughter had turned into tears. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Steve didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was that someone in his audience was in pain, and every instinct in his body told him to do something about it. He turned to the production assistant at the side of the stage and held up his hand. The universal signal for "Stop everything." The entire studio froze. "Hold on," Steve said quietly into the microphone, his voice completely different from the jovial tone he'd been using moments before. "Hold on a minute." He stepped away from his mark, that carefully positioned spot on the stage where hosts are supposed to stand. He walked past the podiums, past the confused families, and straight into the audience aisle. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't protocol. This was Steve Harvey being Steve Harvey, the man who never forgot that behind every ticket, every contestant, every person in that studio, there was a real human being with a real story. The cameras scrambled to follow him, operators adjusting their angles on the fly, trying to capture whatever was about to happen. The audience members near Margaret instinctively moved aside, creating a path. They could sense that something significant was unfolding, something that transcended the usual rhythm of a game show taping. Steve reached Margaret's row and stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment of eye contact, something passed between them. An understanding. A recognition of shared humanity that needed no words. "Ma'am," Steve said gently, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying through the silent studio. "Are you okay?" Margaret tried to speak but couldn't. The words caught in her throat, tangled up with grief and unexpected joy and embarrassment at causing a scene. She shook her head, not in answer to his question but in frustration at her inability to explain. Sarah, her daughter, spoke instead. She's okay, Sarah said, her own voice thick with emotion. She hasn't laughed like that since my dad died. Your joke, it broke through. The silence in the studio deepened. This wasn't awkward silence. This was sacred silence. The kind that happens when people recognize they're witnessing something real, something that matters more than entertainment, or schedules, or production timelines. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He didn't return to the stage. He didn't try to transition back to the game. Instead, he did something that would become one of the most talked about moments in Family Feud history. He sat down. Right there in the audience, on the armrest of the seat next to Margaret, Steve Harvey sat down. The $3,000 suit, the perfectly positioned microphone, the hot studio lights, none of it mattered. What mattered was this woman, and her daughter, and the story they were living. Tell me about him, Steve said softly. And Margaret did. In a voice that shook and broke and rebuilt itself with every sentence, she told him about Tom. Her husband of 37 years. The man who had never missed their Sunday morning coffee ritual. The grandfather who had planned to teach his grandchildren to fish. The patient who had fought cancer with dignity and humor until the very end. She told Steve that Tom had loved Family Feud. That they'd watched it together for years, shouting answers at the TV, laughing at Steve's reactions. That coming to the show today had been her daughter's idea, a way to honor Tom's memory by doing something he would have loved. I didn't think I could do it, Margaret said, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. I almost didn't come. But Sarah, she bought the tickets months ago, before Tom got sick. And she said, Mom, Dad would want you to go. He'd want you to laugh again. Steve listened. Really listened. Not with the performative attention of a TV host, but with the full presence of a human being who understood pain and loss and the complicated journey of grief. And then you told that joke, Margaret continued, a small smile breaking through the tears. That ridiculous joke about the chicken, and I laughed. Really laughed. And it felt so good but also so wrong because how can I laugh when he's gone? And then I couldn't stop, and the laugh turned into crying. And I'm so sorry for disrupting your show. Ma'am, Steve said, and there was something in his voice that made everyone in the studio lean forward. Don't you ever apologize for feeling. You hear me? Don't you ever apologize for that. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Not a prop, not something from wardrobe, but his own personal handkerchief, monogrammed with his initials. He handed it to Margaret. Your husband, Steve said. He sounds like he was a good man. A really good man. And I want you to know something. You laughing today? That's not betraying his memory. That's honoring it. Because a man who loved you for 37 years, a man who watched this show with you every day, that man wants you to laugh again. He wants you to live again. Margaret clutched the handkerchief, her tears flowing freely now, but something had shifted. The tears weren't just grief anymore. They were release. They were healing. They were permission. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve stood up. But he didn't return to the stage. Instead, he looked out at the rest of the audience, at the two families still standing at the podiums, at the cameras and crew and everyone watching. You know what? Steve said, his voice stronger now, filled with purpose. We're going to do something different today. We're going to remember that this show, any success I've had, it's not about the laughs or the ratings or the viral clips. It's about this. It's about people. It's about connection. He turned back to Margaret. You came here today to honor your husband's memory. To do something he loved. Well, we're going to honor him too. Steve removed his jacket. The iconic purple suit jacket that had become part of his signature look. He draped it gently over Margaret's shoulders. This jacket, Steve said, has been with me through 1,000 episodes. It's seen a lot of laughs, a lot of surprises, a lot of family moments. And now it's seen something even more important. It's seen courage. It's seen love that doesn't end. It's seen a woman who lost everything and still found the strength to come here and laugh again. The audience erupted. Not with applause, not yet. With something deeper. A collective intake of breath, a shared recognition of witnessing something profoundly human. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled a business card from his pocket. Not a production company card or a publicity card. His personal card, the one he rarely gives out, with his private number. You call that number? Steve said to Margaret, looking her straight in the eyes. Not because you need anything from me, but because sometimes, when you're having a hard day, when the grief feels too heavy, it helps to talk to someone who sees you. Who really sees you. And I see you, Margaret. I see your strength. I see your love. I see your pain. And I see your future, which is still full of laughter and joy and moments that Tom would be proud of. Sarah, Margaret's daughter, lost her composure completely. The strong, supportive daughter who had held it together for her mother for 18 months finally broke down. She stood up and hugged Steve, and then all three of them were holding each other, in the middle of a television studio, surrounded by cameras and lights and an audience that had stopped being spectators and had become witnesses to something sacred. The two families at the podiums, who had been competing against each other just minutes before, simultaneously left their positions and walked over. Not to Steve, but to Margaret and Sarah. The competing families joined hands around them, creating a circle of support, a physical manifestation of the truth that in moments like these, there are no opponents, no strangers, only human beings sharing space and compassion. Share and subscribe, make sure this story is never forgotten. One of the women from the competing family said softly, I lost my mother last year. I know what you're going through. Another contestant said, my father always watched the show too. This is for all of them. The producers in the control room, who had been frantically trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected turn, stopped trying to manage it. They just let the cameras roll. Because sometimes, the best television happens when you stop trying to make television and just let humanity unfold. Steve eventually guided everyone back to their positions, but the game that resumed was different. The energy was softer, more connected. When Steve made jokes, they landed differently, with more warmth and less performance. When families gave wrong answers, everyone laughed together, with compassion rather than judgment. At the end of the taping, something unprecedented happened. The families, without being prompted, joined hands and took a bow together. Not as competitors, but as a community that had shared something important. Margaret and Sarah stayed after the taping. They met with Steve privately in his dressing room, away from cameras and crews. What was said there remains between them, but when they emerged, Margaret was wearing that purple jacket, and her face had changed. The grief was still there, it would always be there. But it was sharing space with something else now. Hope. Permission. The understanding that loving someone doesn't end with death, and neither does the obligation to live fully. 3 months later, Margaret sent Steve a letter. It arrived at his production office in a simple envelope, handwritten address. Inside was a photograph of her with her grandchildren at a fishing lake. Tom's fishing lake. She was teaching them to cast, just as Tom had planned to do. She was laughing in the photo. Really laughing. The letter said simply, "Thank you for giving me permission to live again. Tom would have loved what you did. We watched the show together still, me and the kids. And now when we laugh, it doesn't hurt. It celebrates. Your jacket is framed in my living room, right next to Tom's photo. Two good men, reminding me every day that love doesn't end and neither should joy." Steve keeps that letter in his dressing room. Not framed, not displayed, but tucked into the corner of his mirror where only he can see it. Because that day, when he stopped the show and sat with a grieving stranger, Steve Harvey proved something that television often forgets. Sometimes the most important moment isn't the one you plan. It's the one where you throw away the script and just be human. Margaret's jacket still hangs in his dressing room too. A reminder that success isn't measured in ratings or viral moments. It's measured in the lives you touch when the cameras stop mattering and the people start mattering more. That's the legacy Steve Harvey is building. One stopped show, one shared tear, one moment of genuine humanity at a time.